Apache warrior fell for a captive woman, only to learn she carried the badge of his enemy. He saved the woman who stumbled into his sacred canyon, not knowing she carried the badge of the man who massacred his family. The sun hung like a copper coin above the canyon walls when Aiyana first saw her. She moved like a ghost through the red dust, her white dress torn and stained with blood that wasn't all her own. Her feet were bare and bleeding, leaving small dark spots on the stone that would disappear with the next wind. He watched from the shadows of the sacred rocks where his grandfather had once painted stories of the first people. The woman stumbled, caught herself against a boulder, and stood there breathing hard like a hunted deer. Her hair fell in tangled waves around her shoulders, the color of wheat before harvest. She was white, that much was clear, but something in the way she moved told him she carried pain deeper than the cuts on her arms. Aiyana had killed 17 white men. He kept count the way his father had taught him to count coup, each death a mark against the people who had burned Apache children in their sleep. His hands knew the weight of the rifle across his back, the smooth grip of the knife at his side. He could end her life before she drew another breath, and no one would ever know. But she was not a soldier. She carried no gun, wore no blue uniform with brass buttons that caught the light like guilty secrets. She was just a woman, lost and broken in the desert that had become his only home since the cavalry burned his village to ash. The wind shifted, carrying her scent to him, fear and sweat, but underneath that, something else. Lavender soap, maybe, or the memory of it. It reminded him of his sister, who had loved the small purple flowers that grew near the stream behind their old. His sister, whose body he had buried with his own hands after the soldiers finished their work. The woman took another step and her legs gave out. She fell hard to her knees, and a sound escaped her that was not quite a sob, not quite a prayer. It was the sound of someone who had run as far as they could and found themselves still caught in the same night. Aiyana closed his eyes and heard his grandfather's voice, carried on the wind like smoke from a dying fire. The desert teaches us many things, grandson, but the hardest lesson is knowing when to kill and when to save. When he opened his eyes again, she was looking right at him. They stared at each other across the canyon floor, two souls separated by more than distance. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and endless, and in them he saw something that made his chest tight. Not fear, though she should have been afraid. Not hatred, though she had every right to hate. Recognition, as if she had been waiting for him her whole life. "Please," she whispered, and the word traveled on the wind like a prayer. "I can't run anymore." Aiyana stepped out from the shadows. His moccasins made no sound on the stone, but she tracked his movement with those winter eyes, watching as he approached with the careful grace of a man who had learned to survive by reading the intentions in every footstep, every breath. He stopped 10 paces away, close enough to see the way her hands shook, far enough to reach his knife, if this was some kind of trap. She didn't look like bait, but then again, the best traps never did. "You are hurt," he said in English. The words felt strange on his tongue. He had not spoken the white man's language in many moons, not since the last time he had stood over a dying soldier and listened to him beg for mercy in a voice that sounded like wine through dry grass. She nodded, and tears made tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "They killed him," she said, so quietly he almost missed it. "They killed him, and they would have killed me too, but I ran. I just ran." "Who killed him?" "The men who were supposed to protect us." Her voice broke on the last word, and she wrapped her arms around herself like she was trying to hold her spirit from scattering. "My husband. They said he was a traitor, but he wasn't. He was just trying to do what was right." Aiyana studied her face, looking for lies the way a tracker looks for broken branches. But all he saw was grief, raw and honest as an open wound. Grief he recognized because it lived in his own chest, a constant companion that colored every sunrise, every breath. "What is your name?" he asked. "Sarah." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her face. "Sarah Martinez, a Spanish name married to an Anglo woman." The frontier was full of such unions, love that crossed lines drawn by men who had never felt the weight of loneliness in their bones. His own grandmother had been Mexican, captured in a raid, and kept as wife by a warrior who learned to love her gentle hands and fierce spirit. "I'm Aiyana," he said. "Does that mean something? In your language?" "Eternal blossom." The translation sounded foolish in English, but she smiled anyway, the first real expression he had seen on her face. "That's beautiful." He looked at her sitting there in the dust, this broken woman with her torn dress and bleeding feet, and felt something shift inside his chest. Something dangerous, something that felt like the first green shoot pushing through winter ground. "You cannot stay here," he told her. "This is sacred ground. The spirits of my people walk here." "Then I'll go." She tried to stand and stumbled again. When she looked up at him, her winter eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I don't know where, but I'll go." But when she tried to take a step, her legs betrayed her again. She fell forward, and without thinking, Aiyana caught her. Her weight was nothing in his arms, light as a bird with hollow bones. She smelled like dust and fear and that ghost of lavender that reminded him of everything he had lost. "You will die if you travel alone," he said, and the words came out gentler than he had intended. "The desert does not forgive the unprepared." She looked up at him from the circle of his arms, and for a moment they were close enough to share breath. Close enough for him to see the gold flecks in her winter eyes, the small scar on her chin that spoke of some childhood accident. "Then I'll die," she whispered, "but I won't go back to them. I won't let them turn me into what they are." In her voice, he heard the echo of his own vow, spoken over the graves of his family. The same desperate determination to choose death before dishonor, to let the desert claim him before he became the thing he fought against. Maybe that was why he lifted her in his arms. Maybe that was why he carried her deeper into the canyon, to a hidden place where water seeped from the rocks and ancient petroglyphs told the stories of his people. Maybe that was why he built a small fire as the sun painted the sky red, and shared his water and dried meat with a woman whose very presence should have been a betrayal of everything he believed. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he was just tired of being alone with his ghosts, tired of carrying his anger like a stone in his chest. Maybe, in her broken spirit, he recognized something of his own soul, and thought that two wounded things might heal each other if they were careful enough, gentle enough. That night, as she slept curled beside the dying fire, Aiyana sat watch and wondered what his grandfather would say about the choice he had made. The old man had always taught that the desert would provide what you needed if you were wise enough to recognize it. But as Sarah shifted in her sleep and murmured something in a voice thick with dreams, Aiyana found himself wondering if what he needed and what would destroy him might turn out to be the same thing. The stars wheeled overhead like ancient spirits dancing, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate across the endless dark. For 3 days they shared water from the same cup, not knowing that her hidden badge marked her as the widow of his family's killer. 3 days passed like water through cupped hands. On the first morning, Sarah woke to find Aiyana gone and thought perhaps she had dreamed him. This Apache warrior who had caught her when she fell, who had built her a fire when she should have been his enemy. But then she smelled the smoke of burning sage and saw him returning with his arms full of desert plants, their roots still heavy with earth. "For the cuts," he said simply, kneeling beside the small pool where water seeped from the canyon wall. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, crushing leaves between his palms, mixing them with clay until he had made a paste the color of dried blood. She watched as he tested the mixture on his own skin first, a gesture so careful, so protective, that it made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. When had anyone last thought to test medicine on themselves before giving it to her? When had anyone shown her such quiet consideration? "May I?" he asked, holding up the paste, and she nodded because words seemed too small for what was happening between them. His fingers were gentle as he spread the mixture over the cuts on her arms, the scrapes on her palms where she had fallen trying to escape the men who had murdered her husband. Each touch was careful, respectful, as if he understood that her skin had known too much violence already. "What does it feel like?" she asked. "To heal someone instead of hurt them?" Aiyana paused, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Like remembering who I used to be." On the second day, she helped him gather firewood, moving slowly on feet that were still tender but healing. She watched him work, noting the way he moved through the desert like he was part of it, how he could find water where she saw only stone, locate edible plants where she saw only thorns. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked as they sat beside the fire that evening, sharing strips of dried rabbit he had caught with snares so subtle she hadn't even noticed them being set. "Since the burning," he said, staring into the flames. "Since they came in the night and took everything." She wanted to ask more, but something in his voice warned her away from that particular wound. Instead, she told him about her own losses. Not the whole truth, not yet, but pieces of it. How she had loved a man who tried to bridge two worlds. How that love had gotten him killed by men who saw compromise as betrayal. "He sounds like a good man," Aiyana said. "He was." The words came out thick with grief. He believed people could change, that there could be peace between. She stopped herself before she said too much, before she admitted that her husband had worn a badge, had worked for the same government that had sent soldiers to burn Apache villages. On the third day, she woke to find Aiyana sitting by the water, his head bowed, and lips moving in what she realized was prayer. She lay still, not wanting to intrude on something sacred, and listened to the soft rhythm of words in a language she didn't understand but somehow felt in her bones. When he finished, he turned to her with something like surprise, as if he had forgotten she was there. "I was speaking to my grandfather," he said, "asking him what to do with you." "What did he say?" "That the heart knows truths the mind cannot see." Aiyana dipped his hands in the cool water, then offered them to her cupped like a bowl. "He said that water shared between enemies becomes medicine." She leaned forward and drank from his hands, the water cool and sweet on her tongue. When she was finished, he drank what remained, his lips touching the same spots where hers had been. It was communion, she realized, sacred in a way that had nothing to do with churches or prayers she had learned as a child. "Tell me about your people," she said as they sat in the shade of the canyon wall, watching the sun paint shadows across the stone. So he did. He told her about his sister who had loved purple flowers, about his father who could read the future in the flight patterns of birds, about his mother who sang lullabies that could make the stars dance. He told her about a way of life that had been built on respect for the earth, for the animals, for the thin places where the spirit world touched this one. "It sounds beautiful," she said and meant it. It was. His voice carried the weight of past tense, of things that could never be recovered. But beautiful things are easy to destroy. That evening, as Sarah cleaned their simple dishes in the spring water, she felt Aiyana watching her. When she looked up, she found his gaze soft, almost wondering. "What is it?" she asked. "You move like someone who has known kindness," he said. "Even after everything that has happened to you, you still have gentle hands." She looked down at her hands, pale, soft despite the calluses from her desperate flight. Nothing like the work-hardened hands of the Apache women she imagined had once shared his fire. "Is that strange?" "It is rare." He moved closer, and she could smell sage smoke in his hair, see the small scars on his arms that told the story of a life lived close to danger. I had forgotten that such gentleness could exist. Something passed between them in that moment. Not love, not yet, but recognition. The understanding that they were both survivors of the same war, even if they had fought on different sides. That they had both lost everything they held dear to the grinding machinery of hatred that consumed the frontier. When he reached out to touch her face, she didn't pull away. His palm was warm against her cheek, calloused but careful, and she found herself leaning into the contact like a plant turning towards sunlight. "Sarah," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice. Not the flat pronunciation she was used to, but something musical, shaped by an accent that made it sound like water over stones. "Yes. I'm glad you found your way to this place." She wanted to tell him that she hadn't found her way. She had been running blind, stumbling through the desert with no destination except away. But looking into his dark eyes, she thought maybe that was the same thing. Maybe sometimes you had to run blindly through the wilderness before you could find the place where you were meant to stop. That night, she lay on the far side of the fire and listened to him breathing in the darkness. Somewhere between her first desperate gulp of his offered water and this moment, something had shifted. The canyon no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like sanctuary. But sanctuary had a way of making you forget that the world outside still wanted to destroy you. It made you forget the secrets sewn into the lining of your dress, the weight of metal that grew heavier with each shared meal, each gentle touch. As sleep finally took her, Sarah's last conscious thought was a prayer to whatever spirits watched over broken people in wild places. She prayed that this fragile thing growing between them could survive the truth she would have to tell him. She prayed, but deep in her heart, she already knew that some truths were too sharp for even the strongest love to survive. He found the federal marshal's badge sewn into her dress and realized the woman he was falling for was married to the man who massacred his entire family. The fourth morning dawned blood red across the canyon walls, and Sarah knew her time was running out. She had felt it building like a storm in her chest, the weight of secrets, the crushing knowledge that every gentle word between them was built on a foundation of lies. When Aiyana handed her the cup of pine needle tea he had prepared, when his fingers brushed hers in that careful way that made her heart race, the badge hidden in her dress seemed to burn against her ribs like a brand. "You look troubled," he said, settling beside her on the flat stone that had become their morning place. The concern in his voice made everything worse. "Just tired," she lied, and hated herself for how easily the deception came. But Aiyana had not survived this long by missing the signs of unease. His dark eyes studied her face with the intensity of a tracker reading broken branches, and she had to look away before he saw too much. That was her mistake. Looking away when she should have met his gaze, should have found some way to tell him the truth before he discovered it himself. Because the truth she was learning had a way of surfacing no matter how deep you try to bury it. It happened when she stood too quickly, dizzy from days of little food and the constant strain of carrying her secret. The torn seam of her dress, weakened by her desperate flight through the desert, finally gave way. The fabric parted along her ribs with a soft, tearing sound that seemed loud as thunder in the canyon stillness. And there, sewn into the lining with careful stitches that spoke of a woman's desperate foresight, was the badge. Silver and cold, catching the morning light like a guilty mirror. The eagle with spread wings, the words U.S. Marshal, etched in letters that might as well have been carved into Aiyana's heart. Time stopped. Sarah watched his face change, watched the soft warmth drain from his eyes like water from a broken vessel. Watched understanding dawn like the sun cresting the canyon rim, harsh and unforgiving. The cup of tea fell from his nerveless fingers, shattering on the stone and sending up a cloud of fragrant steam that smelled like everything they were losing. "No," he whispered, the word barely more than, but his eyes were locked on the badge, on the damning proof of who she really was. Sarah's hands flew to cover the exposed metal, but it was too late. Too late for anything but the terrible truth that hung between them, like smoke from a funeral pyre. "Aiyana, please, U.S. Marshal." His voice was different now, stripped of all the gentleness that had grown between them, like desert flowers after rain. It was the voice of a man remembering how to hate. "Your husband was a federal marshal." She nodded, the motion small and broken. "Yes." "What was his name?" The question came out flat, deadly calm, and Sarah knew that everything, her life, her soul, whatever fragile love had been growing in this hidden place, balanced on her next words. "Thomas," she whispered. "Thomas Martinez." The name hit Aiyana like a physical blow. She saw him flinch, saw his hand move instinctively toward the knife at his belt. When he looked at her again, His eyes held the same cold fury she had seen in the faces of the men who had killed her husband. Martinez, he repeated, and the way he said it made the name sound like a curse. The butcher of Willow Creek. Don't call him that. The words came out sharper than she intended, and she saw Aiyana's face harden further. He wasn't what they said he was. He led the raid that killed my family. Aiyana rose slowly, like a man moving underwater, and Sarah had never seen anything more terrifying than the careful control in his movements. He burned our village while the children slept. He ordered his soldiers to shoot anyone who tried to run. That's not true. I was there. The words exploded from him with such force that they echoed off the canyon walls. I watched my sister try to crawl away with her hair on fire. I held my mother while she bled to death from his bullets. I've buried 17 people with my own hands, and your husband's name was on the orders that killed them all. Sarah felt the world tilting around her, felt everything she thought she knew sliding away like sand through her fingers. No, that's not Thomas Never, liar. The word cut through her protests like a blade. You knew. All this time, you knew who he was, what he had done, and you let me. His voice broke, and for a moment she saw through the warrior's mask to the devastated man beneath. You let me care for you. I didn't know it was your family. The words tumbled out desperate and broken. I swear to you, I didn't know, but you knew he was a killer. Aiyana stepped closer, and she could see the pulse hammering in his throat, could smell the sage smoke and cedar that had become so dear to her. You knew he murdered Apache people, and you still wore his ring, still carried his badge, still called yourself his widow with pride. He was trying to make peace with the blood of innocence on his hands. He changed. At the end, he was trying to change. She was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. That's why they killed him. His own men turned on him because he wouldn't, because he was going to stop. Aiyana held up his hand, and she saw that it was shaking. Just stop. The silence that followed was worse than screaming. It pressed down on them like the weight of stone, heavy with all the things that could never be unsaid, could never be undone. Sarah looked at the man who had saved her life, who had shared his water and tended her wounds, and made her remember what it felt like to be treated with kindness. For days ago, he had been a stranger. Now he felt like half her soul, and she was watching that soul tear itself apart because of who she was, because of the name she carried. The first night, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, when you held me by the fire. You asked the spirits what to do with me. He nodded, his jaw so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. What if they knew? What if they brought me here so you could... She gestured helplessly at the space between them, at the wreckage of whatever had been building there. So you could have your revenge. Something flickered in Aiyana's eyes. Pain or recognition or maybe both. Is that what you think this is? Some kind of justice. Isn't it? He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw him wrestling with something that went deeper than anger, deeper even than grief. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, hollowed out. If I wanted revenge, you would already be dead. Then what do you want? I want my family back. The words came out raw, scraped from the deepest part of him. I want to undo the day your husband decided that Apache children were acceptable casualties in his war for peace. I want... His voice cracked completely, and he turned away from her, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions too big for any one heart to hold. Sarah reached toward him, then stopped. How could she offer comfort when she was the source of his pain? How could she touch him with hands that had once worn the ring of his family's killer? Anago. He didn't turn around, didn't look at her. Take what water you can carry and go. Where? Anywhere but here. His voice was steady now, terribly final. This is sacred ground. And you, he stopped, shook his head. You don't belong here. The dismissal cut deeper than any blade could have. Deeper than the knowledge of what Thomas had done. Deeper than the guilt that had been eating at her for months. Because somewhere in the last 4 days, she had begun to hope that she might belong somewhere again. That she might find a place where the terrible weight of her name didn't matter, where someone could see past the badge and the guilt to whatever was left of Sarah Martinez. But that had been a foolish dream. Love couldn't survive the kind of truth that lay between them now. Some wounds were too deep, some betrayals too complete. She gathered her few possessions with numb fingers, the torn dress, the hidden badge that had destroyed everything, the small bundle of dried meat he had given her. When she was ready to leave, she turned back one last time. Aiyana stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the canyon wall, where ancient paintings told the stories of his people. Stories that would never include her, would never speak of the 4 days when an Apache warrior and a marshal's widow had found something worth protecting in each other's broken hearts. "I'm sorry," she whispered, knowing the words were too small, too late, but needing to say them anyway. He didn't answer, didn't turn around, just stood there like a man carved from the same stone as the canyon walls, as if he had already forgotten she existed. Sarah walked away, each step taking her farther from the only sanctuary she had ever known, carrying nothing but water and guilt and the terrible knowledge that some mistakes could never be forgiven, no matter how much love tried to cover them. Behind her, the sacred canyon kept its silence, and the desert prepared to swallow one more broken soul into its endless, unforgiving embrace. She was dying in the desert when he found her again. And this time, she told him the whole truth about why her own husband's men had wanted her dead. The desert was trying to kill her, and Sarah was letting it. 2 days after leaving the canyon, she sat in the meager shade of a twisted mesquite tree and felt her life bleeding away with the water she had been too careful to conserve. The sun hammered down like the fist of an angry god, and her lips were cracked and swollen, her tongue thick as leather in her. She could have rationed better, could have walked at night and rested during the day, the way Aiyana had taught her in those 4 precious days when she had foolishly believed she might deserve kindness. But that would have required the will to live, and that had died the moment she saw the light leave his eyes. The badge lay beside her in the dust, pulled from her ruined dress and cast aside like the lie it had always been. Silver, tarnished black in the heat, the eagle's wings spread in an empty promise of protection that had never extended to the people who needed it most. She closed her eyes and tried to remember Thomas the way he had been at the beginning, young and earnest, full of dreams about justice and peace. Before the war had ground him down, before the orders from men who had never seen an Apache child had turned his conscience to ash. But all she could see now was Aiyana's face when he spoke his sister's name. The way his voice had broken when he described holding his dying mother. The terrible weight of grief that had turned love to hatred in the space of a heartbeat. A shadow fell across her, and she thought perhaps death had finally come to collect what the desert was owed. "You're dying badly." Sarah opened her eyes and saw Aiyana standing against the sun like a figure carved from heat and light. For a moment she thought he was a mirage, another cruelty of a mind pushed too far by thirst and grief. But mirages didn't carry water bags, didn't have dust on their moccasins or concern hidden in their dark eyes. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. He knelt beside her, uncapping his water without speaking, and she saw that his hand was steady again. The terrible shaking fury of 2 days ago had burned itself out, leaving something harder but somehow less brittle behind. "Drink," he said simply. She wanted to refuse. What right did she have to his water, his mercy, his attention? But her body betrayed her, reaching for the offered vessel with desperate hands. The water was warm and tasted of hope, and she drank until he pulled it gently away. "Slowly," he said. "You'll make yourself sick." "Why?" she asked again, and this time he understood that she wasn't asking about the water. Aiyana sat back on his heels, studying her face with the same intensity he had brought to tracking her trail through the desert. "I followed you," he said finally. "Why?" "Because my grandfather came to me in a dream." His voice carried no embarrassment at this admission, no apology for believing in things the white world called superstition. "He showed me a vision of 2 people drowning in the same river, each trying to push the other under. He asked me which one I wanted to save." Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, salt she couldn't spare. What did you tell him? That I wanted to save them both. Aiyana looked away, toward the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor. He laughed at me. Said that was the answer of a young man who still believed in easy choices. There are no easy choices, Sarah whispered, thinking of all the moments in her life when she had chosen silence over truth, comfort over courage. Not anymore. No, he agreed. There are not. They sat in silence while the sun moved across the sky and the shadows shifted around them. Finally, when the heat had reached its terrible peak and even the insects had gone quiet, Aiyana spoke again. Tell me about the night he died. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of memory settle on her chest like stones. She had told this story to no one. Not to the federal investigators who had dismissed it, not to the preacher who had buried Thomas, not to the mirror when she could no longer stand her own reflection. He came home different, she began, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. 3 weeks before they killed him, he rode in from patrol and just sat at our kitchen table and stared at his hands. For hours. I made him dinner, and he didn't eat it. I asked him what was wrong, and he couldn't answer. What had happened on the patrol? He'd been ordered to investigate reports of Apache raiders taking cattle. But when he found your people's camp, she stopped, unable to meet Aiyana's eyes. It wasn't raiders. It was families. Old people. Children. They were starving, trying to survive on reservation land that couldn't feed a dog. Aiyana's face remained carefully neutral, but she saw his hands tighten on his knees. The standing orders were to engage any Apache found off the reservation, Sarah continued. No questions, no mercy. But Thomas couldn't do it. Not to children. Not to grandmothers carrying babies on their backs. So he gave them supplies instead. Food, blankets. Told them where they might find game without crossing into white settlements. That was why they called him the butcher. There was something different in Aiyana's voice now. Confusion where there had been certainty. No. Sarah shook her head, tears finally spilling over. That came later. After his commanding officer found out what he'd done. After they threatened him with court-martial unless he proved his loyalty. The truth hung between them like smoke, acrid and choking. The Willow Creek raid, Aiyana said quietly. He tried to refuse the order. I was there when the telegram came. He threw it in the fire and said he was done being their sword. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the dust. But they told him they'd try him for treason. That they'd hang him as an example to any other soldier who thought mercy was more important than following orders. And they said, her voice broke completely. What did they say? That if he didn't lead the raid, they would make sure I was arrested as a collaborator. That I would hang beside him. She looked up at Aiyana through her tears. So he did it. He led them to your village because he thought it was the only way to save my life. The silence that followed was like the moment before lightning strikes, heavy with electricity and possibility and the promise of things being forever changed. After, Sarah whispered, he couldn't live with what he'd done. He tried to drink away the faces of the children. Tried to lose himself in his badge, his duty, anything that might make the guilt smaller. But it just grew bigger. And 3 weeks before they killed him, he made a choice. What choice? He was going to confess. To the territorial government, to the newspapers, to anyone who would listen. He was going to tell them that the Willow Creek raid was ordered by men who cared more about political advancement than justice. That Apache families had died because white politicians needed a war to justify their budgets. Aiyana stared at her, and she saw understanding begin to dawn in his dark eyes. The men who killed him, he said slowly, they weren't raiders. They were his own soldiers, acting on orders from men who couldn't afford to let the truth come out. Sarah pulled the badge from the dust beside her, its weight familiar and hateful in her palm. I carry this not because I'm proud of what he did, but because it's the only proof that exists. Sewn into my dress are the documents he was going to release, names, dates, orders signed by men who were still collecting pensions for their service to justice. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. In that light, Aiyana looked like one of the ancient spirits his grandfather had told him about, older than memory, wiser than human understanding. "You have been carrying his guilt," he said finally. "I married him. I loved him even after I knew what he'd done. That makes me complicit. You were trying to save his soul. I was trying to save my marriage." The honesty of it cut like a blade. I told myself it was about redemption, about helping him find a path back to the man I fell in love with. But really, I just couldn't bear the thought of being alone. Aiyana was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on something beyond the horizon. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "My grandfather used to say that the desert teaches us two things: how to survive and how to let go. Sometimes they're the same lesson." "I don't know how to let go," Sarah admitted. "Neither do I." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw that the cold fury was gone from his eyes. In its place was something more complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. "But maybe we can learn together." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Aiyana built a small fire and shared his water and dried meat with a woman whose name would always carry the weight of his family's blood. They didn't speak of love. That word had been burned away in the harsh light of truth. They didn't make promises about tomorrow, because the desert had taught them both that tomorrow was never guaranteed. Instead, they sat beside the fire and grieved together, for his family, for her marriage, for the innocence that war had stolen from them both. They grieved for a young marshal who had tried to choose mercy and found himself trapped between conscience and survival. They grieved for an Apache village that had died, not because of hatred, but because of cowardice, men in distant offices who found it easier to order death than to question the systems that demanded it. And in that shared grief, something new began to grow. Not love, that would take time if it ever came at all. Not forgiveness, that was still too much to ask. But understanding, perhaps. The recognition that they were both victims of the same machine that turned good people into casualties and noble intentions into tragedies. "What will you do with the documents?" Aiyana asked as the fire burned low. "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "Thomas thought exposing the truth would bring justice." "But justice for who? The dead can't be brought back. And the living," she gestured between them. "Look what the truth has cost us." "Sometimes the truth isn't about justice," Aiyana said. "Sometimes it's just about making sure the dead are remembered correctly." As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of pink and gold, they buried the marshal's badge together in the desert sand. Not as an ending, but as a beginning, the first step in learning how to carry their grief without letting it consume them. They would travel together for a while, Aiyana said. Two broken people sharing the burden of survival in a land that forgave nothing and no one. Where their path would lead, neither could say. But they would walk it side by side, learning the hardest lesson the desert had to teach, that sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to find a way to keep living. And in the vast silence of the wilderness, where Apache spirits danced with the wind and the ghosts of burned villages whispered their eternal sorrow, two souls began the slow, painful work of healing, not from their wounds, but around them.